Okay, welcome to the Jeju Forum 2020. My name is Ramesh Thakur. I'm from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University in Canberra. It is my great honor to moderate this meeting. Today's session is organized by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, APLN for short, as part of the Jeju Forum 2020. The title of the session is Diffusing the China, India, Pakistan Nuclear Triangle. Now let me introduce our panelists. I'll introduce them all together and then they will speak one by one for about 10 minutes each, followed by approximately half-hour panel discussion with Q&A, which I will moderate. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. His research focuses on strategic security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and regional nuclear crises. For the past few years within the APLN, he has certainly been my go-to person for anything I wanted to know about China's nuclear policies. Manpreet Sethi is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. She's been leading the project on nuclear security at the center for the last 15 years. She is an expert on the entire spectrum of nuclear issues, ranging from nuclear energy, strategy, non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, and ballistic missile defense. Firoz Hassan Khan, a research professor in the Naval Postgraduate School in California, is a former Brigadier General in the Pakistan Army with experience in combat action and command on active fronts on the line of control in Kashmir and Siachen Glacier and Afghanistan border. He served as Director, Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs in Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division, Joint Service Headquarters. Firoz had been a key contributor in formulating Pakistan's security policies on nuclear and conventional arms control and strategic stability in South Asia. Sang-Hoon Lee is a senior research fellow at the Sejong Institute in the Republic of Korea. He also serves as president of the Korean Nuclear Policy Society and has previously served as Director General for Policy Planning, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and been policy advisor also to the Ministry of National Unification and Ministry of National Defense. As you can see, it's a very distinguished and very experienced set of panelists, and I look forward to this discussion. We will now begin the presentations. I'll give the floor for the first presentation to Tong Zhao. Tong, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Ramesh. At the end of last year, 2019, Carnegie colleagues Toby Dalton and we conducted some research, including doing interviews with senior Chinese experts on the topic that we are discussing today. And we have some interesting findings. One of the most important one is that China really thinks that India is massively modernizing its nuclear capability, not because India feels threatened from China. Again, this is Chinese perception, not the Indian perspective. But from the Chinese perspective, India's nuclear modernization program is not driven by real threat perception from China, but driven by a goal to pursue national prestige, to increase India's international status. And because of that Chinese understanding of Indian nuclear modernization, a positive impact of that is there is no serious security dilemma from the Chinese side. China is not that concerned about India building up its nuclear capability, and therefore there is no mutual nuclear arms race between the two countries. China takes a relatively relaxed attitude towards India's nuclear activity. But the negative side of this is Even though China does not feel threatened, India is still focusing on China in terms of nuclear capability, constantly modernizing. And as a result, the nuclear gap between India and Pakistan is being widened. And that threatens Chinese interests. China worries about a more imbalanced power structure on the subcontinent, and in order to help make the balance right, China may feel the need to help Pakistan with its strategic capabilities, and that could undermine non-proliferation regime. So China also faces a dilemma. Also, many Chinese experts, they very much dismiss the capability of the Indian indigenous defense industry. Many people argue that India is at least 10 years behind China regarding strategic military technologies. And the result is, for China, it only needs to closely monitoring India's new strategic military development, but it does not feel concerned about India developing new capabilities like longer range ICBMs, or potentially developing MIRV capability to arm with one missile with multiple warheads, or India's development of a sea-based nuclear deterrent using strategic nuclear submarines. The 2019 test of an anti-satellite weapon by India also did not raise too much concern in China. The similar can be said about Indian development of missile defense. Even though in the case of missile defense, India's defensive capability could have a negative impact on the Indian-Pakistan strategic stability relationship, because it could potentially undermine Pakistan's second strike capability. So in that sense, it could again makes China worry about the strategic balance on the subcontinent. There is one exception about India's strategic military capability, which is about tactical nuclear weapons that do raise some Chinese concerns. China feels that India might want to develop and deploy some tactical nuclear capabilities in order to counter Pakistan, but the same technical nuclear weapons can also be used in a conflict with China. But regarding tactical nuclear weapons, the greatest Chinese concern is about their potential use in the Indian-Pakistan bilateral scenario. And now the US is becoming less committed to maintaining stability between India and Pakistan. So China believes that itself should play a bigger role in moderating future conflicts between the two countries. But really, if you talk to Chinese experts, there is no deep thinking yet on how China could do so. And the recent Chinese border conflict with India further undermines Chinese relationship with India, and therefore undercuts its potential influence as a mediator in future Indian-Pakistan conflict. Of course, we are seeing this continued border confrontation between China and India, and some people worry that as the conventional conflict escalates, there might be a growing risk of nuclear conflict. As indeed, the border conflict this year has been the most deadly in over 50 years between the two countries. The engagement roles on the battlefield have been changed. The shots have been fired. But the traditional Chinese view is there is no serious risk of nuclear escalation between China and India for at least 3 reasons. One is China believes both countries have great interests in maintaining their economic interdependence. Neither government wants a war with each other. The second reason is China believes that in both countries, the top civilian leaders are in full control of nuclear decision making. And the civilian leaders have no interest to have a nuclear conflict. And the third reason is the tough terrain on the across the border region would make large-scale conventional war unlikely, and therefore any conventional conflict wouldn't cause huge casualties, and that reduces the risk of nuclear escalation. But all three assumptions, I think, are being challenged today. On the first one, as bilateral relationship goes bad, I think they are reducing their economic interdependence. So the mitigating role played by interdependence may become less salient in the future. And secondly, both countries are led today by really strong men. Both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, they frequently resort to domestic nationalism to rally support. And on the third point, even though the terrain is tough along the border, but with the improvement of infrastructure and military technologies, today they are already deploying massive conventional forces across the border, making the risk of some high casualty, high intensity conventional conflict more likely than before. And there is even one additional reason for a greater nuclear risk, nuclear escalation risk, which is the technology. For both countries, especially when it comes to their theater range nuclear forces, some of their capabilities are indeed entangled between conventional ones and nuclear ones. In the case of India, you have a fighter bomber aircraft that can deliver both conventional munitions and the nuclear bombs. You have short-range missiles like Prithvi that may be dual capable. And in the Chinese case, we certainly have DF-21 and DF-26 that are dual use. So the entanglement between nuclear and conventional forces, especially at the theater level, could cause risks of misunderstanding and misjudgment during a conventional conflict. And some of these theater weapons are already deployed close to the border, and they could be attacked in a conventional conflict. And there is no real awareness of such risk at the government level, and that contributes to escalation risk. So I think the nuclear escalation risk is still small, but has increased compared with before. One last point I want to make is external players is another complicating factor. I mentioned before that China is not really worried about India's indigenous defense capability, but China is very sensitive about any defense cooperation between India and other external powers, especially the United States. And in this regard, China is not really worried about how advanced weapons might be exported from US and other superpowers to India, but China is worried about the geopolitical implications of the defense cooperation between India and the US and other countries. China worried that through such defense cooperation, India might be absorbed closer into the American orbit, for example, and India will side more closely with US to contain China. To some extent, the US plays a greater role in determining China's policy on India than India itself. As the US-China bilateral competition intensifies, there are two schools of thoughts in China on India relation. One is that China should avoid a serious military conflict with India in order to focus on countering the United States. The second school of thoughts goes that China should teach India a lesson in order to deter other smaller countries from siding with the United States in the future. So both schools of thoughts subject China-India relationship to the perceived more impactful China-US relationship. And there are supporters for both schools of thoughts. It's hard to know which thinking is prevailing domestically, but it's certain that future situation will be more volatile and we may need to pay closer attention. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Let me move on to the second presentation, and I give the floor to Manpreet Sethi.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. And thanks to JEJUFOURM and Asia Pacific Leadership Network for inviting me to be a part of this panel with my friends from both sides of the Indian border. I'm happy that we have this opportunity to exchange our views on how to diffuse the rather difficult relationship in the region. There is so much that Tang Zhao said that I'm very tempted to respond to. And that really goes to show why such an exchange is so much needed. So thank you, JEJUFOURM, for this. I think we all understand that the nuclear equations in Southern Asia make for a complex matrix. For a long time, there has been a tendency to see it as a South Asia problem between India and Pakistan. And I think China seems to do that still. But there is a reflection of China on the region, which has loomed since long. And it has only become, I think, more pronounced in the last few years. From India's perspective, China imposes a direct shadow on India, as well as an indirect one through its relationship with its iron brother, Pakistan. But the Southern Asian region is not confined to just the triangular relationship between the three, because China has its primary focus on the US nuclear capability, strategy, and posture. And therefore, the region also experiences the full impact of the US-China nuclear relationship, making it a playground for what I call a chain conundrum, which makes the situation more complex and also very unique. The Cold War experience taught us lessons on strategic stability between two nuclear powers who were more or less evenly matched in their nuclear arsenals. But what we find in Southern Asia are three adversarial nuclear dyads: India-Pakistan, India-China, and China-US, where each country is perched on a different nuclear pedestal in terms of its capability, doctrine, and even stature or recognition as a nuclear weapon state. And each of these dyads is currently suffering from a high trust deficit and a tendency to make the worst case assumptions about the other's capabilities and intentions. And I heard quite a lot about that in Tang Zhao's presentation. Now, I will speak a few words on each of the dyads to explain my understanding of how do you diffuse the situation. This session is about diffusing the triangle. So I'll reach that eventually. But first, I want to comment on the India-Pakistan relationship, which has been problematic since its partition, the partition of the two countries in 1947. And from India's perspective, the liberal use of terrorism by Pakistan as an instrument for creating instability, which has never allowed the relationship to stabilize. Many of us in India and beyond, I think, believe that the possession of nuclear weapons and the projection of their early use, a la the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, is a ploy to deter a conventional response from India while continuing to use terrorism. Now, obviously, Pakistan has its own litany of woes against India, and we hear them from Feroz. But unfortunately, as a result of this gap of, what should we call it, understanding, perceptions, or even a desire for strategic stability amongst the powerful vested interests, the relationship has seen some deep lows in recent years, and it hasn't lived up to its economic and political potential. China adds to this distance. I think even if the larger international community has today called out Pakistan for its support to terrorism, and the fact that Pakistan is on the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force grey list for so long, is testimony to that. The economic and political protection offered to it by China in various fora does not allow or incentivize Pakistan to change its behavior. And that's what I see as one of the dimensions of the indirect shadow of China on the region, by playing benefactor to irresponsible nuclear behavior. And today I hear from Tang Zhao that China would be willing to take it a step further because it senses that there is going to be instability in the region because of India's increase in nuclear capability. which is a perception, I think, in India. Sitting here in New Delhi, I don't see a very large scale, expansion of the nuclear program, but we'll talk about that later. On the India-China bilateral relationship, that was seen to be on a relatively steady keel, despite some serious border skirmishes over the last 3-4 years. I think what has happened this year has taken a major hit on that relationship. 20 Indian soldiers lost and an undeclared number of Chinese soldiers lost their lives to alleged transgressions. From India's point of view, this is a serious inflection point for the bilateral relations. As the military standoff still continues, over 80,000 troops on both sides are dug into the trenches in cold heights of either side of the line of actual control. Many in India are convinced that the relationship will not recover easily. Would there be any ripples of this on the nuclear positions on either side? I don't think so. For China, any change in its nuclear capability and strategy emanates from its threat perceptions from the US. The nuclear modernization that we see in the country is in response to the US ballistic missile defense and the long-range conventional strikes, which China fears is going to degrade its retaliatory capability. So the incipient debates that we see in China about the possibility of either changing its NFU or revising its alert levels or development of hypersonics or deployment of dual-use missiles, all of this is aimed to enhance nuclear deterrence with USA, which it feels has been affected by the American actions. India does not figure into these Chinese calculations, and I think I agree with Kang Zhao on this. But from India's perspective, though its overall conventional capability may suffer from an asymmetry with China, there is also a belief in that in areas of conflict, India has enough capability to be able to deny China any significant gains. Should India increase its reliance on nuclear weapons in face of conventional weakness? Well, taking a cue from similar behavior of other weaker conventional powers, like we've seen Pakistan against India or Russia against US, there are several voices in India too who have started suggesting that we should move to a more offensive nuclear strategy. But in my own view, on the matter, the suggestion of first use of nuclear weapons in situations where the adversary has a secure second strike capability, it can only take us up the escalation ladder, inviting nuclear retaliation without necessarily making a dent on the conventional conflict. Rather, I would suggest that the NFU position of both countries, as well as a similarity in their approach towards nuclear weapons as instruments of deterrence, not for warfighting, has allowed a certain amount of nuclear stability, while the dialogue mechanisms are trying to resolve the issue diplomatically. A change to first use would only bring instability into the equation. And as it currently stands, the nuclear behavior of the two countries has given a practical demonstration of the value of NFU in adversarial nuclear dyads. And I think it's an example worthy of emulation as a nuclear risk reduction measure by the other dyads. So what could diffuse the nuclear relationship in the region? I'm afraid the possibility of a meaningful nuclear dialogue between the three is rather low at this moment. I used to advocate that it is in India's interest to have strategic stability talks with China, despite China's attitude problem about the nuclear status of India. But the prospects of this look extremely difficult, even from the Indian side, under the current circumstances. The overall relationship will have to be mended and stabilized before nuclear talks bilaterally might be possible. Is any arms control possible in the regional triangle? Well, in theory, yes. Many ideas can be suggested, starting with political declarations, such as acceptance of sole purpose of nuclear weapons for nuclear deterrence, or NFU. In fact, 2 of the 3 countries already accept both these. The 3 could also reaffirm a statement like what was made between Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987. Some other more tangible proposals could be, for instance, a trilateral ABM, or perhaps even bringing the US into it and Russia, so that all of us accept mutual vulnerability as a bedrock of deterrence. But unfortunately, the political climate within the region, as well as beyond, does not look right at this moment. Meanwhile, strategic stability talks between US and China could have a benign impact on the region, especially in case it would bring in some element of arms control. Though that looks difficult as of now, perhaps there might be a window of opportunity once there is clarity on the next US president, um, and if he wants to take that further. So let me conclude by affirming my understanding that regional nuclear developments and their future trajectory will draw upon the great power geopolitical equations, presence or absence of arms control, and technological advancements elsewhere. Nuclear developments in Southern Asia um, can be influenced by improvements in the overall security environment between USA, Russia, and China. Meanwhile, within the triangle, platforms for dialogue will have to be found to address the growing misperceptions and tendency to make worst case assumptions on capability and intentions. And I'm glad, therefore, that we are engaging in this exercise. Risks of inadvertent escalation will grow. And I'm ending with the same thought as Tang Zhao had done, which is to say that inadvertent escalation, because of ambiguous capabilities such as cyber offensives, hypersonics, autonomous delivery systems, as they find their way into the national arsenals, the risks of inadvertent escalation grow. A nuclear use that none of us wanted or anticipated would nevertheless be unaffordable for the region in terms of human, material, and ecological losses. And this sense of shared risks needs to be generated within the region so that we don't go down that path. Thank you so much, Ramesh.
Thank you very much, Manpreet. Let me move on to the third presentation. Firoz, I look forward to seeing whether you're going to deepen our pessimism or lift our pessimism. Floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to be saying something which is probably going to be slightly different than what you've heard today, because I can respond to what has been said, but I believe my task was to really come up and scratch my head to figure out how can really a trilateral CBMs or arms control even be possible, which is the paper that I've been writing, and Manpreet and all, we go a long way, discussing these issues for last 20 years almost now. So let me first begin by saying that, the idea was how to define the strategic triangle in this class, just merely because India, China, and Pakistan have a geographical confluence at past, which is a very contested region. They join in Kashmir, the three areas. Does that really constitute a triangular strategic construct, or are there separate asymmetric dyads? That has been already said by Tang Zhao and Manpreet. I want to disaggregate this fact that to really have this discussion whether a triangle truly exists and what does that really mean, or there exist two different kind of rivalries that pushes countries into Machiavellian cooperation of sorts. I'm drawing a lot of my conclusion because the time is less. I won't go into details. But a decade back, we at the Naval Postgraduate School had this whole project called the trilateralism, and the three countries were discussed at length. And there were many other conclusions drawn, but nobody came clearly what exactly was the case. One issue was India is in the middle of this triangle, and India's perception matters a lot. One of the issues was that India views China strategically at a different mode of rivalry, and views Pakistan tactically. And mind one word that, the T word, the terrorism word, is only something that has been talked about in the last 20 years in post 9/11 world, not before that. That has been a different kind of a rivalry before that. The narrative, the language, the grammar was very different before that. So, but we can talk in the Q&A on that. So I will begin by saying that these are two asymmetric reasons, and there were three tiers of the nature of rivalry. And then I will give you some ideas as to why there is a more scope for greater cooperation between China, India, and Pakistan than rivalry, because there's a history. And I was asked to write that paper to figure out what the history was, and then come up what could be possibly done. So maybe slightly different, not as pessimistic, So first of all, the rivalry nature is different at three levels: ideological, territorial, and power asymmetry. The previous two speakers have alluded to that. The problem is that the nature of ideological rivalry between India and Pakistan is much more deep-rooted. That goes back to the partition, that goes back on daily basis. It's much more different than the nature of ideological differences between China and India, which is more about the systems, etc. So that's one issue that I think most of us understand what there. Similarly, the nature of territorial dispute between Pakistan and India is much more emotional, related to partition. It seeps much more deeper into domestic politics. I'm talking about Kashmir in particular. Then compared to that was a border dispute between China and India. That's more strategic and even more possible to be sort of resolved rather than this issue is much more deeper one. And similarly, the power asymmetry, I think the trajectory, both speakers have said the trajectory between Pakistan and India widens as much as trajectory between China and India widens. And this power asymmetric again is when it comes to China, India, it's more both at the system level. There's two rising powers, but as well as the regional level. And in the case of Pakistan, it's purely regional level. There is no system level problem here, even though the confluence may have that cascading effect. And I think Manpreet rightly points out that there's another dyad. So actually, you can call it a quadrilateral because USA cannot be taken out of this whole issue. So each of the three countries have got another perception of encirclement and two fronts. So when you talk about two fronts, the Chinese are seeing two fronts. They're seeing the eastern seaboard as a main front, and secondary front is China. Pakistan, India sees the two front they already talked about. But lately, what I'm hearing from India is something called collusion and collaboration, which points to as if the two have ganged up against the one. Conversely, the other side of the narrative is that India has acted in a manner rather than bringing the two countries together, it has acted in a manner that it has forced the two countries to gang up against India. Well, that debate we can never be able to solve in the 10 minutes here, but I'm just pointing out how the narratives and the debates are changing here. Similarly, Pakistan sees the two front. They see one front with India, which is its main front. It's only focused and obsessively focused with India, and sees Afghanistan as the other front, which again each side believes of encirclement, whether it's a string of pearls, etc. These are the kind of narrative that is going on all the time. The word about the nature of asymmetric warfare has replaced traditional warfare in this time, in 2020 timeframe, than any time before. All of these countries are alleging the other countries. Recently, I heard India alleging that China is also waging asymmetric warfare in India, including cyber war against India after the Ladakh issues and Galwan Valley issues. India, Pakistan have been hurling accusations against each other. The term that is more used now is hybrid war. And at least I'm not speaking on behalf of Pakistan, but I know what's going on there. The Pakistani narrative is now terrorism is an old story now. The Afghanistan it began with that, is going to go away. The new term is fifth generation warfare. The new term is hybrid warfare, etc. And that states have engaged in this kind of activities. And I think there's a lot of issues that Manpreet has brought out, which actually raises a bigger debate, and I would probably agree with that. What has got to do with these kind of asymmetric strategies at a time when technological innovations, etc., are happening in the region, So I will go on to the place as to why I believe that China-India has some history, because I was asked to write all those things. India, China, and China, Pakistan, India, Pakistan, and China, India both have a history of not just wars and crises that we have been talking, but actually a lot of history of actually cooperation. In fact, India, China began with the concept of Panchil to begin, not pessimism, I'm talking optimism here, sir. Think about that. They began with the principles, and I will just, really go over that about the principle of coexistence. Then not much happened after the 1960s, we can go all until in the 1986-87, they had this border crisis in the Samdu-Churung Valley. Until that time, the issues were not there. But the 1993 and 1996 agreement between India and China is very important. And Chair, permit me, because I have to read a couple of things, because this is very important. And I find that the Pakistan agreement, with Pakistan-India agreement, particularly in the 1990s, beginning from 1985, 1989 agreement of non-attack on each other's nuclear installations, the 1999 agreement on military CBMs, and followed by a series of dialogue that was started by Indian Prime Minister Mr. Gujral on peace, security, and CBMs, leading up to nuclear test, and followed by a great document, which I can proudly say that I contributed to that, the Lahore Agreement of 1999. If we are looking at all these agreements between China, India and Pakistan, you can very clearly see there is a great deal of overlap into the kind of ideas. I'll first go over the ideas that why would India not agree with Pakistan on those very ideas on which it would agree with China? This is one thing. India wants to talk to Pakistan on nuclear issues only. China doesn't want to talk to India on nuclear issues. India's CBMs with China are all conventional related. Hardly anyone is the one that talks about nuclear issues at all. India does not talk about conventional restraints. So China doesn't want to talk to India on nuclear issues. India wants to talk to Pakistan on nuclear issues. Pakistan doesn't want to talk on nuclear issues unless conventional restraint is brought into the process. And then we get into this loop, which Tong Zhao, you mentioned about how the Chinese view the Pakistan-India strategic imbalance. And this is where the whole problem of bringing about a sort of a strategic restraint agreement between India and Pakistan that is the only thing you need. Otherwise, there is a lot more to talk about in terms of CBMs. I'll just flag a couple of points before, because, both sides, China and India, talked about minimal military presence, not to undertake military exercise. In fact, they also asked for identification of offensive forces along the border. And in fact, the more I read the 1996 agreement, which has been declared veritable no-war pact between India and China, to avoid every kind of thing that can happen, I'm really surprised as to with the existence of those kind of agreement and the fact that India-China forces are not as armed as the case is Pakistan and India on the line of control. I would agree with Tong Zhao, and I'm not sure what the Chinese perception is. It is, from a Pakistani viewpoint, it is highly unlikely that the India-China border skirmish could escalate into a major conventional war for many reasons you already cited, Tong Zhao. But for the reason that neither side is actually willing to fight a major war, but neither side is willing to concede either. And if you look at India-Pakistan problem, this is probably the same case as the one I'm winding up. India-Pakistan are also having the same issue that, they don't want to fight a war, but they're not prepared to concede in the process. So I will just, I had a lot more points to say, but I'm getting the whole signals from there. I will finally simply say that Pakistan had offered India the strategic restraint regime. India rejected that. They don't want to deal bilaterally. Now, here is a chance to deal with them trilaterally. If you wish to, we can discuss these issues. What are the issues between nuclear, conventional, and other restraint agreement? And we have all these agreements we can put together. And I think if anywhere, the best forum, in my opinion, that's going to be in my paper, is that India, Pakistan, and China sit on one organization that is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where all of three are together, including Russia. And that's one place where the mandate of Shanghai Cooperation Organization addresses everything that Dr. Manpreet Seri you have just said about. So I would suggest those are the ideas, and I can say more because for paucity of time, I'm stopping, I'm looking at the clock. This is almost 10 minutes. I'll stop here, but there can be agreement on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Feroz. It's more than 10 minutes, but it was very deep and very interesting. Thank you very much. Let me move on to the fourth presentation. I give the floor to Sang-Yuen Lee, and we can get a perspective from outside the three countries. Sang-Yuen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the three excellent presentations. As you mentioned, South Korea may be a little bit outside to this discussion because South Korea is a non-nuclear weapon state. And also geographically, South Korea is a little bit away from this nuclear triangle. But it seems to me a nuclear issue is becoming a really global issue. It is not just a matter of a dyad like China, India, or India, Pakistan. So it may be not just a matter of a dyad or a triad, but it is a global issue. As we for obvious reason, South Korea, even though we are a little bit away from in China, India, Pakistan triangle, but we have our neighbor nuclear issue in North Korea. So many Koreans tend to think from a lens of a North Korean nuclear issue, the whole nuclear strategic and geopolitical implication through that lens. But nevertheless, I would like to share some of my observation with these, along with these three excellent presentations. So it seems to me we are getting into an era with unprecedented uncertainty in geopolitical and economic and security sense. We have COVID-19. is pandemic we have never seen before. And also on the extension of that uncertainty, we are witnessing increasing, worsening strategic competition between US and China. And also recently in international politics, the overall trend seems like that we are witnessing a weakening or worsening of function of the international institution or regimes in every aspect of the global mechanism, not just non-proliferation, but we are weakening climate agreement. And also we see, for example, US terminated US-Russia INF treaty, and JCPOA is also quite uncertain future. And free trade and even democracy is under attack all over the world. So my observation, first observation is like this. So it seems to me India, China, India, Pakistan nuclear triangle, can we think it, view it from on the extension of the recent weakening global non-proliferation regimes? So we three presenters already, previous presenters already mentioned from China's position, India's position, and Pakistan's position. But unfortunately, all three presenters indicated some uncertainties and geostrategic uncertainties. And also, I feel like it's a little bit pessimistic in the near term to get any compromise to how to diffuse these tensions among key players. So, given that recent trends may be the overall weakening of a global institution and regimes, how can we find a clue to revitalize this global mechanism? So, NPT is one of them, and CTBT. And also all sorts of geopolitical and political risk associated with the nuclear issues. So I think that's one of the issues that we all face in the coming years. And second question issue is that I would like to let me put this way: does a nuclear weapon contribute to peace among rival states? So this is the relationship between nuclear weapons and conventional military confrontation. So previous presenters mentioned about China-India border clashes. It may be strategic, political, and religious motivations all work together to make this latest confrontation. Of course, maybe nuclear calculus may be weak in that instant, but nevertheless, we see a risk which might escalate into a big dispute or conflict and confrontation. India, Pakistan also has the same tensions in their relationship, territorial, religious, and ethnic identity-based confrontation and tensions. So it seems to me, luckily, three nations still did not have any nuclear exchange. So it is obvious that nuclear weapons may contribute to prevent the catastrophic nuclear war among nuclear weapon states. But it cannot make a peace among regional rivalries nor prevent minor armed clashes. So let me ask this: are we better off with the nukes or worse off? So that's the question that I would like to ask you, three nuclear weapon state presenters. So for the time being, I also feel like that the future prospect may be a little bit pessimistic because we don't see any possibility in the near future to make any breakthrough to these difficulties. So for the time being, the best thing we can hope is to how can we improve CBMs to prevent unintended or accidental nuclear conflict among three parties. And also the prospect is not very optimistic because of the return of geopolitics and in particular worsening US-China strategic competition in the coming years. So final point is that what China, India, Pakistan nuclear triangle implies for North Korean nuclear issue. So we all tacitly assume that North Korea's long-term goal may be to secure its de facto nuclear weapon status after enduring international sanctions for a certain period of time for its nuclear weapon development program. Particularly, many experts believe that North Korea is likely to follow Pakistan's path, right? So, because we already know that there was some exchange of nuclear and missile technology between Pakistan and North Korea, it was quite a concern, like a centrifuge technology for nuclear fuel enrichment. And just a few days ago, North Korea's military parade disclosed a new strategic weapons, celebrating their 75th anniversary of the North Korean Workers' Party. The parade disclosed a previously unseen massive or monstrous long-range ballistic missiles. So North Korea typically used its parade to show off new missiles and weaponry. So given that, I would urge that China in their Pakistan role is quite important for future nuclear would-be states. It is their joint responsibility to prove that nuclear non-proliferation is a better way for the future. So if they fail to do so, sooner or later, we will see a second North Korea or a third North Korea. Is that what we expect in the future? So most importantly, I would like to urge that nuclear weapon states, including China, India, Pakistan, share a common vision that a real, sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula will be possible only when North Korea is denuclearized. So nuclear weapon status is a privilege, but it entails also responsibility. That's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sang-Yu. And we do have about half an hour for discussions. We've had four presentations, of the complicated China, India, Pakistan nuclear triangle. Tong, let me begin with you. Of the three countries, China is the only NPT state party. Of course, this Jeju Forum is being held on the eve of the postponed NPT review conference, which now presumably will be held next year. China is also the only P5 member on the panel from this group of countries, the only member of the permanent member of the UN Security Council. Therefore, not just a responsibility for moderating India, Pakistan, but a global peace enforcement responsibility flowing from permanent membership of the Security Council. Given that China has been a strong advocate of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as the dominant normative framework, and also of the UN Security Council as the only enforcement arm of the international community, how exactly does China envisage dealing with India and Pakistan as non-NPT nuclear weapon possessor states? And along with that, Sang-Yu also mentioned the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT. In this case, of course, we've got China that has signed but not ratified, and India and Pakistan are not even prepared to sign. So how does China view its regional and global responsibilities as one of the 5 designated managers of the global nuclear order?
Well, thank you, Ramesh, for the question. My concern is as the great power competition intensifies, non-proliferation receives less attention from countries like China. The Chinese mainstream view is the other major powers are paying less attention to non-proliferation requirements. The US is actively helping its own regional allies to build up their strategic capabilities. In the case of Japan and South Korea, US is relaxing the limits they impose on their allies for deploying missiles, for example. And US is strengthening its defense cooperation with Australia and India, and in many cases, this might involve transferring of sensitive military technologies. So given this Chinese view, my concern is, it's not, non-proliferation is not receiving priority in terms of decision making. I think you made a good point, as well as other panelists, that it's still really important to strengthen regimes like CTBT, especially when the US is threatening to reconsider some of its previous commitments to the regime. We have to save this by committing more strongly to it. And I think in this case, I would argue China also has a strategic interest to break away from its previous policy of following the United States on these issues. China is reluctant to ratify CTBT because the US has not done so. But I think there is growing recognition within China that China needs to bolster its international image in the area of non-proliferation, in the area of non-proliferation arms control. So I think CTBT ratification could be one thing that really strengthens China's international image in this area. There is no certainty whether the government would actively consider it, but in theory, I think that's something China can do to show its leadership. Regarding the India and Pakistan, South Asia situation, I think there is, the Chinese view on its nuclear relationship with this region wouldn't change anytime soon. And at the government level, people still argue that China shouldn't recognize the nuclear status of India, and therefore there should be no formal nuclear dialogues. But there is growing recognition that at the unofficial level, people should start talking with each other. Including on the issue of risk reduction, including on the issue of understanding the implication of new technologies on inadvertent nuclear escalation. Some Chinese experts even argue that in the case of India, the defense scientists have played a very important role in domestic decision-making. So maybe the defense scientists between India and China, and some even proposed a trilateral discussion among India, China, and Pakistan in this regard, so that the experts could discuss these issues first and then pave the ground for more official level discussion, and hopefully they could contribute to more confidence and clarification of strategic intentions.
Thanks, Song. Manpreet and Firoz, in that order, let me throw the same question to you. As non-NPT states parties, do you believe it is in the interests of India and Pakistan to protect and preserve the NPT? And if so, what can these two countries do from outside the NPT? Alternatively, would the two countries be happy to see the NPT framework collapse? Manpreet first.
Well, I'm speaking, as an Indian, and there could be many views on this, but I don't think India wants to see the collapse of the NPT. We all understand the value that the NPT has as having maintained non-proliferation, brought it to a certain level, and nobody wants to see that, dissipating in a hurry. So what can India do from the outside is to continue to honor the principles of the NPT as it has done right from the beginning. You mentioned China as the P5 nation, which holds the responsibility for the NPT, but well, we do understand and we all know that the nuclear weapon states within the NPT have not always lived up to the commitments that they took, whether it was on non-proliferation or disarmament. From the outside, India has continued to maintain its loyalty to those principles. India was amongst the first countries to ask for an NPT And Ramesh, you would remember in the 1960s when India was party to the negotiations on the conclusion of the NPT. And then because of the manner in which the treaty was created, India had to withdraw from that. We maintained a rather hard position on the NPT for a long period of time. But ever since the Indo-US nuclear deal and the fact that, the NPT is pretty much marginalized in India's engagement on nuclear commerce with the world, India has made its peace with the NPT. And I think nobody wants to see that, breakaway or fragment in any form. That's my position on the NPT.
Firoz?
I would sort of agree with Manpreet what she said about the same thing about Pakistan, that I've never heard in Pakistan anyone have been involved in it, so opposing NPT. In fact, both India and Pakistan have been one of the key countries who have been very upfront. All kind of treaties and agreements and protocols that followed from 1970s right till the 1990s, and I've been involved in together in that to really bring about. Why they cannot join NPT is very much very clear what it is. But there's a specific view in Pakistan that I can share with you, which is that Pakistan's interest in preservation is NPT is somewhat analogous to its interest in preserving the structure at the United Nations, where the P5 countries are also the nuclear weapon states. And they see that India is challenging the United Nations structure, which would automatically mean that NPT structure would be changed. And therefore, they don't believe in Pakistan that India has interest in NPT anymore, because it's kind of a convoluted way of saying that NPT regime has helped India, especially after the Indian nuclear deal. So there are differing school of thought in Pakistan as well. One said that NPT is no longer relevant anyway, given after the nuclear deal that India did, because United States itself is not very serious about NPT itself. That was the leader. And especially US has not ratified the CTBT itself. So the comprehensive test ban treaty sort of waned away. But I can tell you something, that India and Pakistan differed a lot on the comprehensive test ban treaty once it was open for signatures. Pakistan approach was different than that of India. India opposed that totally. And I know for a fact, because I was involved in it, Pakistan came this close to signing the CTBT even. But were it not for the US non-ratification, they backed off. And the other school of thought was that if India is not signing, we will not sign. That's just a psychological position, not a logical position. So I think both Pakistan and on CTBT and NPT, the Pakistani diplomats and Pakistan diplomacy is very proud of their role, what they play. But they know that in the real world, it really doesn't matter. Something what Tongzhao you said about, that they are seeing greater competition happening. To them, balance of power is more important than the arms control era. So unfortunately, this is what the view exists there.
Thank you. Sang-Hyun, do you see any cross-relevancies of this discussion for how to handle North Korea?
Sorry. Obviously, Korean Peninsula is one of the regions that not only geopolitical, but also any security relationship is very heavily determines the interaction among not only between two Koreas, but also these are pretty much ingredients that determines those Korean behavior externally. So I'm not sure how can we diffuse tension on the Korean Peninsula. Recently, South Korean proposed an initiative, for example, to officially declare the end of the Korean War. But again, North Korea responded with a heavy military parade. So this means that we have some structure and geopolitical problem to address the nuclear peace on the Korean Peninsula. So I don't believe that North Korea is not working with either of the three countries today presented. But anyhow, at least North Korea needed some lessons from nuclear countries that eventually having a nuclear weapon not only gives their privilege, but also they have a lot of difficulty and also trouble and responsibility I think that's what I expect from three nuclear countries presented today.
Thank you very much. Feroz, let me come back to you with a second question, which builds on something that both Tong Zhao said and you said. Tong talked about his project with the Carnegie, in particular the joint project and paper he did with Toby Dalton. He didn't use the phrase today, but in that paper they use this phrase decoupled deterrence. And that ties into what you were saying, Feroz, in the sense that you've got these two simultaneous dyadic relationships with entanglement. And James, acting at Carnegie, has talked about entanglement in the way that Tong used, which is between conventional and nuclear. But of course, we also have entanglement of different dyads in this case. And so this is a chance to come back to you and ask you, can you show us a way forward to disentangle all this and find some hopeful features of both nuclear risk reduction measures and hopefully abatement of the geopolitical tensions, both of which feed into each other? Well,
you're absolutely right. I mean, your question actually explains the complexity and the difficulty of the nature. Not only just Toby Dalton's paper, and I read that paper, that you wrote with Toby, and there is another paper written by Vipin Narang and Christopher Clary about this decoupling idea. India's doctrine is viewed that it is decoupled, one with China and one with Pakistan now, which is where the Pakistani perspective was that they, first of all, never believed in India's declaratory position of no first use. And they say, well, we already knew what it was. So that's one dimension of the issue that's going on. What I was alluding to in my paper to answer your question, that how can we do that? My paper, which eventually will come to you, will talk about how can China, India, and Pakistan sit down together to talk about a process or mechanism, if at all they do that. And I again sort of said it in the closing remarks that SCO mandate talks about. So there are three issues that can be talked about. And this was the original paper 22 years ago that actually I'd conceived, and Manpreet is well aware of that, called a strategic restraint regime. Now, that was a restraint regime between India and Pakistan bilateral. I would suggest it has to be a trilateral or a much larger restraint regime in which the role of outside powers include, because everyone is affected by the other. And therefore, a much larger arrangement has to be done, which involves a three interlocking position of conflict resolution issues between all three countries. And I can list those with Aksai Chin, Kashmir issues, Xinjiang issues, Tibet, Baluchistan, Arunachal Pradesh, all issues can be brought together because under the rubric of separatism, extremism, terrorism, the three mandate of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All countries are member of that. That's one place that you can discuss at least the bigger issues that is at the bone of problem, both territorial issues as well as asymmetric warfare issues. And the other issue is the nuclear and conventional restraint. And I mentioned that in my presentation, I'll repeat that. There is no, as Tang is saying, if India and China are not talking about nuclear issues and they talk only about border adjustments, and India only wants to talk about nuclear restraint with Pakistan, not on conventional issues. So India is ready to accept offensive forces, low force zone against its border with China, but not on the border with Pakistan, which Pakistan is saying, let's create a low force zone. So if all three countries identify offensive forces, both in nuclear and in conventional restraints, we can easily talk about a sort of a non-deployment agreement, and there are a series of agreements they can do so. Finally, I can say something which is maybe a little bold about that. China can become party to the non-attack of nuclear installation that is bilateral between India and Pakistan. We can extend that to China as well. It can be very easily done. Similarly, they can even expand this to include not to attack each other's command and control centers. That could be another one way of doing this, There are many other proposals. Again, in Carnegie, I could suggest one, which is Stimson Center, about a unified missile flight test regime that may including Russia as well, And finally, I would say there are a lot of maritime CBMs that can be talked about. And many of the Indian admirals and Pakistani admirals that I've been dealing with have talked about maritime CBMs, given the fact that we're not talking about Indian Ocean at all right now, but Indo-Pacific Ocean. There's concern about Gwadar Port. There is concern about sea-based deterrence that India has introduced and Pakistan has introduced in its own way. And there are concerns about Chinese activities in the Indian Ocean. We have various forums that we can discuss these issues as well, particularly many of the rules of engagement in the Indian Ocean, etc., or incident at sea agreements. There is a long list of things that can be done by the three countries, especially when we are hearing perceptions in Delhi about activities in Andaman Nicobar Islands and the Straits of Malacca. Then we are hearing activities in Northern Arabian Sea. These misperceptions can only be done by a forum like you have organized here. We are talking track 2, but we can talk. These are the areas where the three countries can talk. I'm just suggesting where the forums are available. So I can go on and on, but these are the basic problems. I hope this is sufficient answer.
Thank you. No, it is. Manpreet, your response to this, and also if you'd like to build into this, the earlier point you made in your initial presentation about the potential for trilateralizing, if not universalizing, no first use doctrine.
Thank you. I'm very happy to hear the suggestions from Feroz on the possibilities which exist. And personally, I would love to, explore the possibilities of many of them and how much the three can come together on this. First of all, I mean, China will have to get over the attitude problem that it has, that it doesn't want to engage with countries which are not NPT members and therefore not grant legitimacy to them as nuclear weapon states. That will have to be the first hurdle to be crossed. But good luck to Feroz, for floating these ideas. And hopefully, sometime the political climate will be right to take them on. Sir, to your issue about strategic restraint regime, and you've mentioned it more than once, unfortunately, there are no takers in India for the strategic restraint regime because the conventional asymmetry that you feel from Pakistan to India, that is beginning to rankle India with China now. And in fact, as a result of what is happening in Eastern Ladakh, you are actually going to see the conventional asymmetry become greater because the focus of India is on building its conventional capability. I don't think, Tanzao, the focus is on nuclear buildup. You had mentioned in your first initial remarks that India is massively building up its nuclear capability. I don't see that happening. Whether you look at the numbers, well, in terms of numbers, India is behind Pakistan and China. MIRV capability, India hasn't officially made any statement on developing or deploying MIRV capability. Yes, it has been exhibited through the multiple space launches that have been done. But no official statement has been made that India is interested in deploying a MIRV capability with the missiles. Dual-use ballistic missiles. India has been very conscious of the fact that it doesn't want to get into entanglement. So except for the aircraft, which are dual-use capable, the missiles are not. The ballistic missiles are all nuclear capable. Prithvi is no longer talked about. After the Agni series has been operationalized, Prithvi is pretty much an obsolescent system, and no one really talks about that as being conventional or nuclear capable. So I don't see the focus on nuclear capability buildup. I see the focus on conventional capability buildup. And therefore, the strategic restraint regime becomes a no-brainer unless we can bring in China into the picture somehow. And I really don't know how to square that circle. But just to add to a couple of points that Feroz made about, some excellent suggestions, I think there is also this information in the public domain regarding the alert levels of all the three countries, that the arsenals are in a demated and a de-alerted state, which is a huge advantage for stability in the region. So if this can be formalized, if the alert levels at the low alert levels can be formalized in any form, I think that would be very useful as well. And this should happen before China moves on to the early warning systems with Russia, which is causing concern about its actually giving up its low alert levels in the future. Also, fortunately, in Southern Asia, I think we are still away from destabilizing capabilities like accurate missiles, BMD, and hypersonics. Tests have happened. Possibilities of deployment in China happening quickly are also there. But if we can move on any of these, I think that would also be useful as part of that kitty of risk reduction, strategic stability that you're talking about. And lastly, to come back to that point I had made about the possibility of NFU. Now, largely countries which are not NFU are extremely dismissive of it as a declaratory statement. But I think it's more than a declaratory statement, because the seriousness of your commitment to no first use is evident in your force structure and your force posture. So if China is going to change its NFU in the future, we see that it'll have to change its alert levels, it'll move in different directions. And therefore, till the time that's not happening, the commitment to the NFU is still taken seriously by India. So I think there is room here for us to explore. Pakistan's standard position has been to be dismissive of NFU. It's every country's business to undercut the doctrine of the other and to say that this is not a credible doctrine. But even after having a declared first use, I don't see any country being able to use its nuclear weapons first because of the secure second strike capabilities with the other. So unless you can carry out a disarming or a decapitating strike, first use is actually not a credible strategy. And therefore, we need to understand the futility of a first use and move towards NFU, which will again change the political atmosphere in which we are dealing with these particular issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tong, do you want to add anything to this discussion?
Sure, of course. Manpreet, I agree with you that India is not building up its nuclear forces in terms of numbers. What I said in my presentation is the Chinese perception is India is massively modernizing its nuclear capability, especially in terms of the qualitative capability, including new technologies, etc. So I think you are right that conventional buildup is a bigger concern. You said India is well aware of the risk of entanglement between nuclear and conventional capabilities. It may be the case, but I don't think the risk of entanglement has been well recognized here in China. In fact, China is still massively building up its dual-capable missiles like DF-26 without any in-depth discussion about its implications for crisis dynamics. I agree with you, Manpreet, that countries should discuss low alert level of their nuclear forces. There is growing interest within quarters of the Chinese military for shifting towards launch under attack posture. In fact, one senior recently retired official from Chinese, the PLA Rocket Force, recently said publicly that China has already acquired the capability to conduct a launch on warning or launch under attack. So I think it's high time that such countries start discussing the full implications of making such a shift towards a higher level of nuclear alert and towards postures like launch under attack before it is too late, before countries already implemented them. With the emergence of new technologies, I think it's necessary for countries like China, India, and maybe Pakistan to discuss issues like anti-satellite weapons. I think both countries are increasingly reliant on outer space for both civilian and military purposes. They should have a common interest in avoiding debris generating ASAT tests. So there is room for some confidence building measures to build norms on non-testing of destructive anti-satellite weapons. With the emergence of new nuclear weapon systems like nuclear submarines, sea-based nuclear weapons, there is risk of maritime nuclear confrontation. India worries about China's attack submarines threatening Indian SSBNs in the Indian Ocean. And China is monitoring Indian discussions about sending maritime capabilities to the South China Sea in a crisis in order to prevent Chinese naval movement towards the Indian Ocean. So I think experts certainly should start discussing all these scenarios where conventional military weapon platforms can threaten each other's maritime nuclear weapon platforms and therefore creating risks of escalation. Ramesh, you mentioned about the decoupled deterrence between China and India. I think one issue is between the two countries, there is no recognition of the perception gap. China doesn't think that it needs to discuss the mutual vulnerability relationship with India. China doesn't recognize that India is trying to secure its second strike capability against a growing Chinese nuclear arsenal. So we have to acknowledge that at least there is real concern on the Indian side to secure its nuclear deterrent with China before we can take measures to mitigate that urge to further modernize and build up. So first step, I think, is to seriously look at each other's discussion and thinking and understand that there's a real perception gap, and that's the basis from where we can build more confidence and mutual understanding.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time frame, so I'm going to give you all of you 1 minute each for final wrap-up thoughts, and let me start in reverse order because Sang-Hyun missed out on the last question. Sang-Hyun, 1 minute to give us any final thoughts.
Well, thank you. I think that this is the time that we must share that a nuclear weapon status is both privilege and responsibility. So frankly, from a non-nuclear weapon state perspective, current status of a nuclear non-proliferation regime is sometimes disappointing and sometimes quite dissatisfying, right? So and also with that disappointment, security uncertainty is growing all over the world. So from a non-nuclear weapon states perspective, growing security uncertainty and disappointment with the progress of the denuclearization regime. So what's the option? There may be more and more states that will be tempted to have their own nuclear weapon. I think it's the joint responsibility of the nuclear weapon state to stop that things happen in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Firoz.
Yes, sir. Let me just say some of the closing remarks. First of all, I will agree with Manpreet that at least we came to one thing, that a sort of a non-deployment, non-alert is something that all three countries can agree upon. Let me say two things about what she mentioned about. China and India both have to change a little bit of their attitude in order to come to this position. While China may not consider India and South Asia's peer competitors, but there's a reality that subcontinent is a nuclear subcontinent, and they should give up that position to discuss. And for India to make that happen, India is also loath to any idea of outside intervention in any of the subcontinent affairs. India has to give up that, given the fact that the complexity is much more. So both China and India have to change their respective position for anything to move forward of the kind of discussion we are having. And finally, I would say that we have discussed not much of technological, we have hinted on that, but I still believe that these dual-use technologies are still in the making. And even if they are not, I mean, this forum can clarify, but at least within the countries, they're not convinced. There are 6 technological maturations, and overlaid with that is the new emerging technologies happening, and we require discussions on that. Aerospace, cruise missiles, BMD, MIRVing, tactical weapons, sea-based deterrence. And overlaid with that is cyber, artificial intelligence, and autonomous bodies are being talked about, UAVs, precision-guided munition. This is all getting into conventional and nuclear arsenals where these misperceptions are growing, which is why I suggest that all three countries must sit down together. And one final thing about China as well, we know that there's an INF treaty that was thrown out, yanked out. And one of the reasons was that China was not part of that. it's about time that at the global level, something has to be done with Russia, US, and China to sort of bring the INF Treaty of sorts, and perhaps even bring India and Pakistan into this whole thing. Could be one idea going forward in the future, because these three countries just can't start working in isolation if others are doing something else, So I will just stop on that one. So.
Thank you, Manpreet.
Thank you. I will pick up on the point that Feroz ended with, which is to say that something has to happen at the global level for it to filter down to the region. Extremely important. And universalizing INF has been spoken about earlier. Looks extremely difficult in today's time, but certainly worth exploring. But perhaps the idea of a more multilateral ABM, I think, will be a good starting point to get us to get over some of the tendencies of modernization. Tang Zhao said India is modernizing. Well, India is building up its capability for the first time. You modernize when you already have something. Agni 5 is not even operational yet. So to talk about accuracies of Agni 5, I think is still quite some distance away. But yes, the work towards creating a credible deterrence in all the three countries, I think, continues. There is nothing like a perfect credible deterrence, and every country will continue to address the threat perceptions that it faces. Just two last points. One is about India's nuclear arsenal being about status and prestige. I think that's the farthest from the truth. And if China is believing that, it's bought into some of the literature which has appeared from the West to say that India developed nuclear weapons or it's developing that capability now for prestige and status. There is a strong security motivation, and therefore the need for the three of us to sit down together and talk about these security motivations, which is leading to an enhancement of the arsenal. I think India gave itself a rather sane and a stabilizing nuclear doctrine. My worry is that we should not be influenced by others who could, who are looking in many other ways on increasing the capability. Lastly, on India being drawn into the American orbit. Well, India has tried very hard not to be drawn into the American orbit. And what has happened with China now has led to more and more voices talking about the possibilities of linking up with the US on several issues. So if the intention of the US was to keep away India from the orbit, I think it's done exactly the opposite by pushing India more with the US than it was in the past. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
I very much agree, as Manpreet just said, that there is a real perception gap. One example is the Chinese view that Indian nuclear weapons is driven by a prestige objective. China has to start acknowledging the security motivations, and that's the basis for a more constructive discussion. Between China and India, there is clearly a growing strategic rivalry, hostility. I think there is urgent need to separate their nuclear relationship or their general military relationship from this growing strategic rivalry. We need to build guardrails to manage this growing competition at the political level and the strategic level. Including to reaffirm non-proliferation norms, to set up new norms on destructive technologies like ASAT weapons. Again, I think there's low chance of any official dialogue anytime soon, but there is growing interest to have expert level discussions on these issues, and that should pave the way for managing the growing political rivalry.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating at today's session. To all the people watching this program, you may not necessarily go away with greater optimism than when we started, but I hope you will have a much firmer understanding of the complexities and the difficulties that make it such a sobering situation. It was my great pleasure to run this session as moderator, and also, of course, thank you to the Jeju Forum for the great opportunity, and to the staff of the APLN for facilitating this discussion. I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you very much. Goodbye.